vote, and the biggest evidence for the generation left hypothesis, bigger than anything that's happened in this country, is the opinion polls showing 60% plus of Americans under 30 saying they have positive feelings about socialism. But I told my fourth grade elementary school class in DeKalb County, Georgia, in 1981 that I was a socialist, and I might as well have said I was a Satanist. That was the response I got from my teacher and the rest of the class. So that is a shift. That is a significant shift. I think what we're talking about is variable responses to the crisis of authority and legitimacy on the part of the global political elite who have administered neoliberalism. And historically, as I've always said, when an elite, especially an elite which is publicly committed to certain kinds of social liberalism and kind of cosmopolitan culture, loses authority, all other things being equal, it benefits the populist right. They're the most obvious beneficiaries, partly just because they're the ones with millionaire backers, which people on the left don't have, and they're the ones with newspapers, and they're the ones access to the media. But it is a really interesting contingent question, like why in Britain and the States, why has the left been able to some extent, to capitalise on that as well in the way it hasn't in other places. And I think we would need more comparative work about what's going on in other countries and Europe and other European countries to be able to answer it. Sorry?
Southern Europe, the left has certainly been.
Yeah, you're right. It's happened in Southern Europe. Anyway, someone wants to come in.
Yeah, shall I stand up?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to sort of come back and sort of endorse what you just said, but from a boomer, self-confessed boomer point of view. Because I think maybe you'll recognise this experience. I mean, I was also sort of energised as a teenager in the late 60s and a student in the early 70s, probably up until really the 76, which is really when punk began, by that kind of combination of libertarianism and a sort of communal vision. But I think, for a lot of people, and I think Jeremy, you recognise this from what you said about the left shrinking into this kind of cranky cult, that there was this silent despond that we went through when there wasn't an alternative to kind of fire your imagination. This is why I think the second part of what you said about having a future that you can orient yourself around. There was a period when there just wasn't one, yeah. And I think now somehow, I mean, weirdly, for me in my personal experience, I've been sort of re-radicalized in my late 60s, but now I feel like these imaginaries, as they're called in the theory, are terribly important because they kind of energize you emotionally around possibility. So I think we've gone through this narrative curve of there being lots of sense of possibility, then an absolute sort of desolation of that, and now there's a revival of that. And I think we should be optimistic about people of our generation coming back to that sense of possibility. And I think there is an opportunity to cross the generation, the so-called generational divide there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Alice?
I have a question for Keir. Isn't there a risk by looking at age and generation of some sort of reinforcing identity politics? And I say this because, for instance, for me, when the future gets erased, then what we have left is what we are and not what we can be potentially.
Stick that in your pipe and smoke it.
Very, very nicely put.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, but the project I'm putting forward is not to let's celebrate a politics of youth. It's like, how do we escape a politics of youth? Right? Like, how do we make this not a split amongst generations? Right? How do we find class commonalities between the older generations and younger generations? And in the book, I put forward various ideas of how we might go about stripping at least a decisive layer of the over 65s. I mean, there is a decisive layer who play a very, very important part in left organising. Anyone who's involved in left organising, you know that, like the world transforms, you get lots of young people and you get lots of over 65 people. And quite a lot of the book is actually about how the left can, how knowledge from past generations can be passed on to the young, basically. Of the forms that takes, the barriers that takes. But in the book, I sort of end on this argument around that we need to reinvent adulthood, basically. Right? And I make this argument that our conception of what a successful adult is based around the attributes of private property, right? Even in our love relationships, ownership, etc., etc. And in fact, all of the markers for what a successful adult is have either been blocked for young people or they've just been delayed in life. Basically, the age at which you have your first child is like 10 years older than in the 1970s, I think, or maybe 80s. I should have written that down. The similar picture of when you first get married, etc. Obviously, owning your own home became a very important marker of being an adult. Well, that's just not on the cards for you young people, I'm afraid. And so this is the analysis that's been blocked, basically, this model. So we could open that up. We could try and pass policies to try and open that up again, right? To try to build lots of new houses and change mortgage lending requirements so that young people can buy. But then you're into a generational conflict, right? If young people get access to buying new houses, that comes at the expense of older generations. So my argument is something like we need to reform adulthood around the attributes of a different form of property, which is the commons, basically. And it's partly this, is that the basis of conservative thought is fear of dispossession, right? I have my property and I'm scared that somebody's going to come along and take it away from me. Who's going to take it away from you? Is it the poor? Is it the foreigners? Or is it the young? Right? And that accounts for quite a lot of the tendency of the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, for people to get more conservative as they get older. Private property is rivalrous. Either I have it or you have it. So there's fear of dispossession. The commons is not rivalrous in that way. The digital commons is basically non-rivalrous, but a commons would be something where we govern it together in order to decide how it's used, basically. So the fear of dispossession goes away. Right? And so what I mean by that would be all sorts of things. Reclaiming the digital commons, but primarily would be collectivizing housing on a really big scale. And you can imagine all sorts of ways in which that could be done to include. To overcome the sort of generational segregation that you get in housing. So you could have co-housing co-ops in which younger people have reduced rents if they, are taking the care of older people. And so and the old and the young have got a lot to offer each other, right? That the retired have got the most precious fucking commodity in contemporary society, which is free time. Those who don't have to work, those who are properly retired, And what is one of the worst parts of old age is isolation. It's increasing isolation as you become an adult, you get more isolated. As you get into old age, you get isolated. And that's what, to overcome that barrier, is what the young have got to offer the old. Do you know what I mean?
Lynne, you definitely have stuff to say about that.
And what the old have got to offer the young. I mean, it seems to me what we have to be thinking of doing is enriching the whole sphere of politics. I mean, you were talking about voting patterns, and that is significant, but to shift voting patterns will also mean enriching everyday life, and touching on housing is one thing, but also if you think of grassroots movements, if you think of the voluntary sector, older people are very strongly involved in that, and particularly globally, they're often led by older women, actually. Because they're concerned with the bread and butter issues in everyday life. So if we're really bringing in the politics of everyday life, the politics of care, at a time when there is such a crisis of care, very few of the young people have time to care at all, and that includes middle-aged people with children who don't have time to take off from work to care for their own children, so they have to bring people in from the third world and so on. There's a global care crisis, which it seems to me is one way of thinking about how we enrich all politics, to rethink the nature of care and where we construct spaces to see what an alternative society can look like, and that will feed through into electoral politics. Today, finally, we did have Jeremy Corbyn shaking hands with Greta Thunberg, I think the 16-year-old who's iconic of climate change. And so there you have young and old, but also movement and parliamentary politics coming together. That is the world that we have to enrich and build on, and it does build on some of those ideas from the 70s, when at the end of the 70s, many of us went into electoral politics precisely because Thatcher had been elected. That's why we have Jeremy Corbyn in my constituency, people like me campaigning to get this left politician into the Labour Party. Okay, he couldn't do much for 30 years. Now he can, and now we can still be there making sure he can do more and go further than his own imagination, having been diminished through being in parliamentary politics, as it always would be, for 30 years, can expand again with the help of movement politics feeding into it.
I'd also say, like the last time people had a really good go at reinventing what adulthood meant was in the 60s and 70s, where people like Lynne were trying to, really break down this property-based conception of the nuclear family, etc., and try to reinvent adulthood. Quite often, actually, around because lots of the attributes of youth, the sort of freedoms attached to youth, etc. I see the baby boomer generation as like, that was a nascent left generation, and in fact, the last time that the left had a really good chance and go at changing the world, they were a nascent left generation that got defeated in the 80s and 90s, unfortunately. First by militarised policing, etc., and then by these sort of inducements, basically, stuffing their mouths with credit or something like that.
I mean, a lot of this, what seems to kind of be implicit in a lot of this, is this sort of reinvention of the household. It seems to me, because the household, the 20th century, the late 20th century, bourgeois ideal of the household, it encodes both a set of ideas about property and a set of ideas about household and a set of ideas about the segregation of the generations, and it's. Yeah, you're right, but the budgeting as well. The idea that the household is the unit. The household is the unit which budgets, the unit which consumes, and I mean that's obviously something people like you've been involved in before, is that trying to the idea of communal housing, and I think it's really significant. It's really significant to me that is. I mean, to me, that is one of the most sort of besmirched, elements of the sort of counterculture and of the sort of politics of the 60s and 70s. It's just, sometime in the 80s it became completely conventional wisdom that the kind of communal living had been one of the most disastrous experiments of the 70s. They'd all been like sex cults and they'd all killed each other and gone mad. Yeah, you're still doing it. Yeah. Well, this is the thing. My own experience is kind of moving to London and sort of meeting people who'd grown up in these houses, but none of them were mad, none of them were cultists, none of them had been drug addicts. They all seemed quite happy.
And we're all still on the left.
So I think that is really important. It's really important, and I think it has to be. That's something we do need to get onto the sort of political agenda as a sort of demand. I mean, my experience. I mean, Joe and I thought we wanted to have a collective house. We went to the bank and they could tell us what they told us, said to us. And we said, we won't be doing that then. You want to set up a collective house, a proper one that we've got some stability in London. In the late 1990s, that's not happening at all. So I think it does depend on conditions. It does depend to some extent on government and being willing to endorse a different model, indeed a different model of adulthood, actually, a model which says that you're not, it's not the only way of attaining adulthood, is to, get a house of your own with your partner and your 2 kids and your dog.
And not use the bus.
And never use the bus, exactly. No, you're right, it's a really good point. I mean, Thatcher promoted that idea, and Thatcher famously said any man who's using a bus over the age of 30 is a failure. Have I told you how we're getting back to mine then?
Well, I would say that I imagine most of the younger people in this room probably live in shared housing. It's not some sort of like experiment in communal living that they've chosen for a political reason. It's just that's basically how you live in London.
But it's insecure, you're living in shared housing in London, it's deliberately insecure, it's made into something that's not sustainable. Like if you don't want to have the fear of being like thrown out. with you on the streets with your children. And that, that's what really has to change. I mean, it is changing. Actually, actually, we're seeing some of the pressure is changing that, and we have seen. I mean, Sadiq Khan coming out for rent controls and saying he's going to stand on a platform at the next election, demanding that the mayor be given the power to do that. That's something I never thought I would see, to be honest. Yeah, you're right. So, is there any? Okay, we've got somebody up there.
Just wanted to ask what your opinion is on the chances of a legitimate left government pushing left economic policies being sustainable in the long run in an environment of globalized capital. So in the sense that if you are pushing these policies, investment just floods out of the country, the economic impacts are negative, and so voters just turn to back to neoliberal policies anyway.
Who wants to take that one? All right, are there any more from the floor?
Yeah.
Well, let's,
Oh,
hang on, no, you were first, and then.
sorry. Yeah, I'm really worried about like really young people playing games and the kind of culture around forums and around gaming online is just so regressive culturally and politically, in my opinion, and yet it feels like one of the key places of intergenerational, like young people of kind of advanced kind of intergenerational play. Like I used to always go to the skate park and as a 10-year-old, as a 11-year-old, and hang out with people that were 10 years older than me there, and I thought that was really important, and I got a lot from that's what I class as kind of intergenerational. But I'm so worried about that the only kind of older kids still playing online are just far right, horrible, regressive, racists and xenophobes and fascists basically. And that's what I'm really worried about, that maybe like that there is a left generation, but beyond that, beyond this generation, however young it stretches, that there's again a kind of white pushback. And what's your
Okay, let's comment around it.
Yeah, I haven't read your book, and I very look forward to reading it. But I'm wondering, just a question I have that relates to some of the comments made earlier. Do you make a distinction between right-wing culture and neoliberalism? Because one lesson that we learned from Greece is that they do have different socio-historic coordinates, and they do play out differently. I mean, the conservative parties in Greece nearly imploded, not because of endorsing the neoliberal agenda, but because of the name dispute with North Macedonia. And we really learned the hard way that the two do not necessarily align. In fact, neoliberalism is more successful when it aligns itself with the right-wing ideology.
All right, shall we take those?
Oh God, I can't remember. Well, these two are about the rights. I mean, I'll be honest. I don't. I mean, one of the absences in the book is like a lack of focus on this, on the fascist right or the nationalist right. It's more of a focus on, because I'm trying to work through how the effects of 2008 and how neoliberalism falls apart. Yeah. Okay, so the neoliberal consensus falls apart then at that point. So yeah, I mean that is probably an absence, and I don't claim to cover everything in the book. That'll be Generation Right. That's my next book actually. Note to self.
Speaking of which,
I'll write that in a prison like Gramsci. And then it's this idea of the young people. Young white men are embracing sort of 4chan sort of culture, this sort of like right-wing 4chan culture. I'm pretty sure Zizek sorted that on a weekend actually, didn't he? Joke.
he recruited many people for 4chan.
So these are none of these are universal things. When we talk about any sort of categories and how they relate to politics, we're talking about patterns which are not universals, etc. I would say that you know, when we do look at like opinion polling, we'd have to say that is a minority position amongst young people, and in fact that's sort of where it gets its charge from, that whole, you know, alt-right thing, as being, you know, a counterculture, sort of a pseudo-countercultural embrace, or, you know, the embrace of that sort of pseudo-countercultural dynamic. In fact, we were discussing this the other day on one of our podcasts, and we were saying that, yeah, the problem with them is they're not counterculture enough, right? Because what, you know, it's counterculture which just embraces the old, you know, they're not weird enough, basically, you know, they're not weird enough because they just embrace the you know, race science and all of this, you know, the most hackneyed of, like, you know, attempts to naturalize the world. Unlike the counterculture of the 1960s and 70s, which was all about pushing beyond what, you know, these naturalized categories. What was the first question?
What are we going to do about globalisation?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. How does a left government survive survive attacks by globalised capital? Well, I would say it's outside the remit of my.
Do you want to answer any of those?
I would say this though, like, Britain is in a very different situation to Greece. Like, Greece got defeated, and they were basically probably on a hygiene to being defeated. As soon as they got elected, there was probably no way out. Well, the only way out was like to go out of the EU for Syriza, and going out of the EU would have meant serious disruption. And, you know, we have that whole transition trough we talked about earlier. Big transition to get gains later down the line. Britain is in a different. It's not in the euro. It's got a central bank, you know, and we basically don't know how that would play out. Basically, you know. Obviously, I just don't know how it plays out. You know, perhaps Corbyn gets elected and Sanders gets elected, and then you're in a very, very different situation. You know, you're in a sort of Thatcher-Reagan situation, perhaps. In the book, you know, when I sort of look at the electoral turn, you know, I sort of map it this way, that, you know, in 2011 there were all these movements, and they were completely against representative democracy, and they were for participative democracy, and, you know, really picking up on some of the sort of like more libertarian themes of the 1960s. In some ways that was like a poor inheritance from that whole anti-globalization cycle which I was involved in, right? Who really embraced the sort of horizontalism, etc. But they embrace it in a particular situation, and then in 2008 Occupy pick it up and try to embrace it in a situation in which it couldn't function in, basically. But when I look at the electoral turn, I sort of make this argument, in fact, the electoral turn doesn't take the form of some sort of apostasy to what went before, right? It's not like, oh, let's reject everything that went before that. In fact, it's much more about, okay, we reached the limits of that, and how can we then struggle, you know, in this other realm in order to open up space for us to struggle in this, you know, non-electoral realm at the same time. There's really serious problems with doing that, and there are probably one of them is that electoral politics is this huge suck of focus, and it, you know, the energy needed to change the Labour Party is apparently quite big. But I see that as a sort of almost a spontaneous politics of generation left, and, you know, any sort of form of left government in the UK would need very, very strong autonomous social movements to push it to act as a counterweight to all of the pull to the right, which is going to come from the media, the establishment, and from global capital, etc. But beyond that, I haven't really got an answer to the world's problems.
Yeah, we're certainly going to need strong social movements, but we're going to need strong regional alliances, aren't we? I mean, I think that first question is so real and so frightening to me, really, and it's why the left Remainers are so upset about us leaving Europe and wondering, you know, how on earth, having allowed so much deindustrialization in Britain, having outsourced both our welfare and, you know, and so many resources, and allowed so much of our industry to decay, how can we possibly rebuild it? And I do know people are trying, and there are left economists trying to advise the Labour Party, although they're, many of them, very worried because they don't think there's been strong enough moves against Brexit, and they're particularly worried about how we do build those sort of left alliance if there were to be a Sanders government, which is unlikely in the US, or if we can somehow get more progressive left governments in Europe, which we're not seeing at all, although in Finland by a tiny amount I think the left beat the right there, and not in other European countries. So thinking of how to build regional electoral alliances, regional metropolitan alliances and so on seems to me crucial, at the same time as doing that, trying to enrich the left at community level, and at all these alternative public spaces for survival that we're going to need.
Yeah, I think, I mean, on game culture and 4chan, etc. Again, on the archive from last year, we had a seminar with Alan Finlayson, who's kind of the person who's researching kind of alt-right culture, etc. at the moment. So there's a lot of discussion of that. I mean, it's an open question. I mean, he shares your view. He's a professor at East Anglia, and he shares your view that this is much more dangerous than it might look, based on just the opinion polls. I don't have a clear opinion about it, but I think there is an awareness in various circles that is important. That formation needs to be challenged. I think projects like Means TV. Means TV is a project to set up a socialist, TV platform in the state, coming out of the States. And I think those guys, for example, I think are quite aware of the need to address things like games culture. So I think people are aware of it, but I agree. I mean, I think we do need socialist games culture. We do need socialists to get in there gaming. Definitely. That's it.
1 hour a week.
Yeah, it's a class. It's your duty to the class struggle to get in. Get in those spaces. I think. Yeah, I mean the globalization. I mean the issue. I think there's on the issue of the globalization and the success of a socialist government in a global economy. I mean, I think the historical record is pretty clear on this. That you need at least one of two things. You need a highly mobilised population, which is conscious that it is fighting a war, for its own autonomy against a global enemy. That's what and there are examples mostly from Latin America of that happening. You're highly unlikely to get that in the UK. It's not impossible. You're highly unlikely to get it. Or you need a bit of luck. You need international allies. I mean, I would say, I don't think that's new though. Actually, I think it's a bit of I think it's true that the situation is specific. It really intensified by globalisation since the 70s. But I don't think we'd have got the post-war welfare state settlement in Britain if you hadn't had the New Deal administration in power in the United States. That was part, and I think the Corbyn project without kind of Sanders or at least Warren or somebody of that, like that in the States, it is very unlikely to succeed. Just but I think there's every chance of that happening in the States. The alternative is. I think also the alternative would be a socialist wave in Europe, across Europe. I think I don't think we can rule that out. I think it's very uncertain what's happening in France right now, for example. And the reporting of what's happening in France in this country is absolutely abysmal. The Gilets jaunes movement is being reported as a right-wing populist fuel protest, which it isn't at all. That was one of the initiators for it. But the key demand of the Gilets jaunes is for direct democracy. They've got a whole critique, they've got a crisis of representative democracy under neoliberalism, and it's not being reported in this country at all because the British political class can't get their fucking head around it. Excuse my language.
Sorry, as a French person, token French person, just to correct that, the French actually, if you look at their parliamentary system, have more direct democracy. There are fewer people who elect each member of parliament than there are in the UK, and the Gilets jaunes started against the fuel tax.
It started that way, but that's their political demand.
But even if you read French media, which I do, they are still reporting it as a right-wing movement because Marine Le Pen came up recently. She's all snuggling up with Trump's advisors, and if you look at the demographics of the Gilets jaunes, they are a lot of people from Mélenchon's party. They are definitely there, but they are being out-vocalized, especially in the French press, by the FN. Or her new party. So it's not just here, it's also the French media is screwing themselves by, token French person,
Right, yeah. I only look at the French left media, so I wouldn't really know what that means.
Just à savoir, you know, the French are screwing. It's not just you guys. You guys don't suck. It's also the French.
We do. Yeah.
It's a universalism.
No, I understand. No, I understand the point. No, it's a fair point. The French, the kind of liberal media, don't really understand the nature of the formation. Which is an ambivalent formation. I'm not saying the Gilets jaunes is fantastic, but I'm saying it's very. I mean, it's, you know, I wouldn't make any bets about where France is going to go in the next 5 years. And think, you know, yeah, I wouldn't make any bets about where any European country is going to go. So we don't know. But you're right. I mean, without any of those things, without a socialist wave in Europe, or a socialist presidency in the States, effectively socialist presidency, or a level of mobilisation absolutely equivalent to World War II of the population, then a socialist government in Britain will definitely fail. Sorry, Nadia was going.
Yeah,
A girl had a question.
I don't know, Jeremy. Like, we've got a whole podcast about being able to imagine the future, so that seems like a little bit glum. I just wanted to respond to that by saying something in the spirit of the podcast, which is just because you can't imagine it being possible doesn't mean it isn't going to happen. And I think that part of the whole kind of capitalist realist project, as the bit that's been most successful, is cancelling our ability to see that possibility. And I think we can sit and analyse it till the cows come home about how, like, it will be and will not be possible. But I think, like, the pact that people have to make to each other as part of the collectivity is to, like, take a chance and push through anyway, and that maybe this time we'll push the boulder over the edge, and that we will result in some kind of much more utopic future, because the stakes are so high now. So actually, I think I'm very optimistic. But what will have to change is people, like, taking that risk in some sort of collectivity. I think rather than trying to rationalise it. If we try and rationalise it, we'll all be depressed and drink ourselves to death.
Well, you're not going to talk me out of the importance of rational thought, or the importance of strategy. I mean, taken to its logical conclusion, that's just millenarianism. That's just saying, because if we all want it hard enough, it'll happen. You have to make these kinds of analyses so that you can strategise. I think you're right. I mean, you're right. You're fine. I mean, basically, the logic of your argument. Anyway, you're not saying anything that's inconsistent with what I said. You're saying that it will require that. You're disputing my scepticism about the possibility of a mass mobilisation of the population. I don't think you're saying we wouldn't need it.
I wasn't particularly disputing and expecting that this was going to be like there's a difference between us. I was picking up on the end of, like, the fabric or the feeling of the end of that conversation in response to what was said at the back, just saying that there's another way of reading it, which is that the possibility of collectivity could actually push through this regardless, because tipping points happen in history where, exactly as you were talking about in the beginning, Keir, and you were all discussing, you cannot quite you cannot predict them, as it happened in Egypt and other places where something will happen, and we have to make a pact with ourselves at that point to be able to push through with that possibility, even if we can't see what the future looks like.
Sure, yeah, sure, I agree.
Right.
I agree with you.
We'll do a podcast on that.
But I think, I'm a Gramscian. I think you need pessimism with the intellect and optimism of the will.
Fantastic.
But I think you need, my own view is not my own. This is a real difference. I don't feel the need to think I'm going to win, like, to do it. I think the odds are against us. The odds are always against the left. They always have been. It doesn't mean you stop trying, and sometimes you win. You only ever get the victories, because you push for the unlikely. The victory in '45 was unlikely. The victories of the '60s and '70s were unlikely. They're always unlikely. Personally, it doesn't help me to tell myself that those victories are more likely than I really think they are. But I don't think that has to be. That's not a condition for kind of emotional pessimism. You're right. You're absolutely right. That's not a condition of kind of affective pessimism. That's like recognising that those are the conditions under which we have to be, like, hopeful.
I think all those calculations get changed by the climate crisis. So it's not about total victory or total loss. I did lay out two possible futures in there: full fascism or full communism. But, like, the likely outcome is, in fact, somewhere in the middle, and, like, there's always something to fight for. Like, every point of a degree of global global warming that you can prevent, you know, you're going to count that in the hundreds of millions of lives either dead or severely diminished. Do you know what I mean? You know, there's no. You know, the hour is too late and the situation is too serious to worry about what's possible or not. You know, basically, the task is before us is fairly clear, I think.
Someone here.
Okay. I just want to say something about the question about still keeping with the theme of possibility, but I just want to say something about the question about can a left-wing government survive in a neoliberal, globalized world. I'm really in sympathy with that position, and I wonder if kind of the other part of the question is possible that a right-wing government that we have now, are they in control of power and decision-making in a neoliberal, globalized, capitalist world? And I don't think that it is certain that that right-wing party, political party, is directing making decisions in this situation. So I'm raising the possibility that asking the question, is politics even if still possible in this situation of kind of a neoliberal globalized capitalism? But I don't mean to say that to kind of dampen the hope for a left-wing movement. I'm just asking if, and I think it's not certain, if it's possible, is it still possible that party politics is still possible? Is that still possible? Yeah.
I wanted to respond to what Keir said about climate change, because it reminded me of something that great pessimist Terry Eagleton said, which was that even at our most pessimistic, with climate change coming, perhaps it's inevitable with the failure of oil and other climate catastrophe, that we'll go back to the situation that William Morris once thought we'd be in, of having to rebuild our green cities and feed ourselves and so on. So that is one scenario that some climate change people see, although I think that pessimism might be a bit too optimistic.
All right, I think we've got to wrap it up now. Siri, you want to come and do the spiel?
Thank you much, Bill. It'll be really short. Thank you, everyone. This has been great. Thank you, Keir and Lynne. And can you hear me? I'm just going to chat.
Introduce yourself.
Okay. Yes. I'm Keir. I'm from the Anti-University. I'm one of the organisers. And this has been part of the Anti-University, which is an ongoing programme of self-organised, radical learning, mutual education events outside and against the academia, the neoliberal university. So sorry to everyone with your multiple degrees. I haven't got one, actually. And this is the second part of the Cultural Power Politics programme. And at the end of the first one, we did announcements, which was sort of announcement that people here might want to share about the movements or the events that they're organising. So I'm going to make one. So the Anti-University is this year between the 15th and 22nd of June, and there'll be about 150 events, and they're all free, and you're all welcome to learn from each other and educate each other. Anyone else got announcements to make about events? I can make more announcements. There's also the Anarchist Festival, just before the Anti-University, at the very end of May and the 1st of June, which is also free, and mutual education and so on.
And they're all in venues right across London.
Around the country and the world.
In fact, we've got a global anti-university now.
That's right.
Right now.
So you have a Facebook page?
There is a Facebook page, and there is antiuniversity.org.
Oh, sure, you know, the 8th of May, there's
there are facilitation workshops for the Anti-University, so to kind of skill ourselves up and learn from each other about how to run events or how to organise and kind of facilitate events. And there'll be 3 in London. That will be on the Anti-University website. There is the Green Anti-Capitalist Front event on the 4th of May, sort of responding to Extinction Rebellion. There is a United Voices of the World party this weekend, which is great. It's the most radical trade union. Surely other people have announcements.
I've got
Someone there's
Yes.
got
Just
people there.
shout.
Yeah, there's also a climate justice event tomorrow at Marble Arch. This sort of in against the Extinction Rebellion thing.
What time?
Climate justice workshop 11:30 Marble Arch, Asad Rahman and
Okay, great.
Brilliant.
I don't know if any real ones matter, Joe.
Did you have one, or was that the same?
no, I've got one. 16th of May, decolonizing the study of Palestine, 71 years after the IOE.
All right, great.
I've got a quick announcement. This has been a very nice conversation. I've enjoyed it, but for me, it's about pushing products. So I've got a few copies of Generation Left. If anyone wants to buy one, I'll give you a very good price.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Rudy Market Bar, for giving us this fantastically